Welcome everybody. My name is Stefano Braghiroli. I'm a researcher at the Institute of Government and Politics of the University of Tartu, and today I'm going to talk about the EP's perspective on two European crises that affected the European Union in the past decade. The first one is the institutional and constitutional crisis that followed the rejection of the European Constitutional Treaty in 2005 by the French and Dutch voters. And the second one is the current economic and financial crisis that is affecting the member states of the European Union. The European Parliament has proven to be a key actor in both the crisis and in the management of them, and moreover has been strongly affected by both. I will try to highlight a link between one and the other and somehow to show how the consequences of the former affected the latter. So let's start with defining a timeline of the EU institutional and constitutional crisis. Well, what we know is that in 2005, the French and the Dutch voters rejected the constitutional treaty approved by the European Convention and signed by the member states. That created a kind of political and institutional shock that affected the European governments and the European institutions, and gave and what we can see is that from 2005 to 2007 an institutional and political impasse affected the European Union and the European institution, the so-called reflection period. During that reflection period, a number of discussions were held on the ways out of this institutional crisis, and a number of groups, more formal and informal, were involved in finding a way out of the crisis. Worth mentioning is the Plan D by the European Commission, Plan D meaning like democracy, dialogue and debate, in order to involve the public opinion and the European voters in defining a solution to overcome this institutional crisis. An end to the political and institutional impasse of the Union was given by the German presidency in 2007. In 2007, during the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Treaties of Rome, the German presidency issued the Berlin Declaration, in which it was clearly stated that somehow this period of reflection and this period of impasse should have been overcome, and that the reform of the treaties couldn't be postponed anymore. Following the Berlin Declaration, things went fairly fast, and between June and October 2007, an intergovernmental conference was convened in order to propose a treaty change on the basis of what was produced by the European Convention and of the Constitutional Treaty. The new amendments, the new treaty amendments, were signed in 2007 in Lisbon. And therefore, the draft of the Lisbon Treaty was already ready by the end of 2007. The ratification process started fairly fast and went fairly smoothly, as these changes were presented as amendments and not as a new treaty. However, the ratification process faced a moment of a successive moment of shock in 2008, when the Irish voters, the only one required to vote on with the referendum on the treaty, rejected the reform treaty in 2008. A second referendum was held in Ireland in 2009, and this time, following Europe-wide pressures and few treaty changes, the Irish voters voted in favor of the new treaty. What is relevant to say is that the reform treaty, although it contains most of the features of the constitutional treaty, doesn't represent a new arrangement, a new treaty per se, but it's basically a treaty that revises and amends the current treaty and maintains the current treaty structure. Moreover, while the constitutional treaty was shaped and defined via a conventional effort involving all the European institutions and the civil society and the national instances, the Reform Treaty was basically defined by intergovernmental dialogue between the member states, with only a minor involvement of the European institutions, that is the European Commission, and even less the European Parliament. Despite the limited involvement of the European Parliament, with only 3 observers in the Intergovernmental Conference, the Parliament has been granted with a number of new powers and new responsibilities that affect very sensibly the current institutional framework of the EU. Well, first of all, the codecision procedure in which the European Parliament is a perfect equal co-legislator with the Council of Ministers has been extended as the ordinary legislative procedure of the European Union. It applies to almost all the areas of competencies of the EU, and it has been extended to more than 40 new areas, with very few exceptions, including foreign affairs, security, and defense. Most of the areas are now decided by codecision, or let's say by this ordinary legislative procedure, and these areas include very sensitive policy areas like immigration policy, cohesion policy, agriculture, home affairs. Moreover, it's very relevant to say that the European Parliament has been granted more effective budget powers comparable to those of a normal parliament. Those powers extended the competencies of the European Parliament in financial and budget planning of the EU, and doesn't distinguish anymore between compulsory expenditures and non-compulsory expenditures. Moreover, a more direct link in terms of more democratic more evident democratic connection has been established between the results of the European Parliament elections and the appointment of the European Commission. The treaty clearly states that the composition of the Commission has to somehow reflect the results of the European Parliament elections. Moreover, the European Parliament can induce the European Commission to initiate legislation. And if the European Commission doesn't initiate a legislation following the stimulus of the European Parliament, then it has to justify its denial. The last point is a restructure of the composition of the European Parliament with a fixed number of MEPs limited now to 750 members, regardless of the number of member states. A number of studies have been conducted on the consequences, on the impact of the Lisbon Treaty, that is on the way out of the constitutional and institutional crisis, on the EP dynamics, on the dynamics of the European Parliament. Well, first of all, what seems to emerge is an increasing process of normalization that makes the European Parliament more similar to a domestic parliament in terms of powers and in terms of voting systems. In terms of powers, because the powers have been extended widely, and in terms of voting system, because the qualified majority voting has been extended in almost all the policy areas. This seems to have had an impact on the voting dynamics and on the voting alignments of the European party groups. The voting alignments seem to be less consociational and more ideologically aligned. A number of studies have claimed that the European Parliament dynamics were characterized by the so-called Grand Coalition, including the 2 largest European parties, European party groups, that is the European People's Parties and the Social Democrats. What the more recent studies claim is that this consociational approach has declined following the new power and the new voting systems introduced by the Lisbon Treaty. On the other hand, as a repercussion of this, what has been claimed is an increase of the intra-party cohesion. That is, the party groups appear more cohesive than they used to be in the past. And a stronger role of the European party groups is also proven by the stronger and more relevant role of partisanship in defining the parliamentarians' voting stances vis-à-vis their nationality. That is, like, parliamentarians' ideology appear to be much more relevant than their nationality when it comes to the definition of their voting stance. However, we should not forget that despite these new dynamics, and basically despite the way in which the European Union defined its way out of the institutional crisis via the Lisbon Treaty, still a number of exogenous factors affect the voting dynamics of the European Parliament. This can be of territorial, national, and individual nature. Moreover, we shouldn't forget that as the European Parliament is now an equal co-legislator with the Council, a number of domestic and nationally oriented pressures directly arrive from the European government. In this respect, FAS, in a very well-known article published in 2003, puts it in this way. Bargaining in the Council of Ministers is often very difficult and time-consuming. Once a compromise has been found there, national governments do not want the EP to overturn it. Hence, they put pressure on their MEPs to vote for the compromise, even if that implies voting against the line of the EP party group. Now, here you can see the distribution of party groups in the European Parliament and in the European Council, bearing in mind this bicameral approach in which basically the Council represents one chamber of the European parliamentary structure and the European Parliament represents the second chamber. What we see is that in the European Parliament, the three largest parties account for more than 75% of the seats, leaving to the non-mainstream parties only 25% of the remaining seats. In the Council, this composition stretches, and basically the mainstream parties control the largest number of positions in the Council, like that somehow account for more than 80%. Now, if we look at the alleged impact of the treaty change on the voting dynamics in the European Parliament, we see that the level of intra-group party cohesion has increased in almost all the party groups, and especially in the groups, in the mainstream groups. What we see is that the largest increase has affected the European People's Party, the center-right moderate, the Socialists and Democrats, the Liberal Democrats of the ALD, and the Greens. However, even among the less mainstream parties, we can see an increase in the party cohesion. The only group that faced a decrease in the party cohesion is the group of the radical left. However, that's a minor group. If we look at the party group's inclusion in the winning coalition, that is basically how the party groups coalesce and succeed to win a vote, what we see is exactly a decrease in the consociational voting styles that characterized the parliament. What we see is that in the previous parliament, that is basically the one like synthesized by the red bars, the level of inclusion in the winning coalitions characterizing the three main party groups, that is the moderate conservatives European People's Party, the centrist Liberal Democrats, and the center-left Social Democrats, have more or less the same level of inclusion in the governing coalition, in the winning majorities, around 85% of the times. What we notice in the current parliament is that the level of inclusion of the party groups change, and on the one hand, while the center-right EPP and ALD increase their level of inclusion in the winning coalitions at around 90% of the occasions, while the level of involvement of the Social Democrats decreases to 80%. Somehow confirming that the voting styles in the European Parliament are becoming more ideological and less consociational, that is, more oriented along a left-right continuum. In this graph, we see the voting coalitions in the winning coalitions in the different issue areas. What we see is that still in all the policy areas, the most common voting alignment is the so-called super grand coalition that includes the conservative EPP, the socialists, and the Liberal Democrats. On average, this happens around 65% of the times. That is, 65% of the times, the largest party coalesce among themselves. However, it changes a lot among the different policy areas. We see that, for example, the super grand coalition is extremely common in constitutional affairs, in internal market, and in development. What we see is, on the other hand, that a grand coalition involving only the European People's Party and the Social Democrats is much more frequent in issues such as agriculture and fisheries that are somehow depoliticized. What we see is the center-right coalition involving only the centrist and center-right parties, that is the EPP and the Liberals, is more common in economic and monetary affairs, while a center-left coalition appears more common in typical issues that fall somehow in the realm of the center-left, such as environment and civil liberties. Now, let's move to the second crisis that the European Parliament is experiencing and is coping with in the recent years. That is the economic and financial crisis. And let's try to read it in the light of what has been said with respect to the European Parliament's approach and the European Parliament's dynamics following the introduction of the Lisbon Treaty, that is, following the solution found to the first crisis, that is the institutional and constitutional one. Well, what I will try to show here is basically in which direction the debate on the ongoing crisis is affecting the voting dynamics of the European Parliament and its coalition alignments. That is the way in which, as we showed already in the previous slides, the party groups coalesce when it comes to the current crisis. Well, the EP's perspective is relevant for a number of reasons that we can summarize in three main points. The first one is that the European Parliament is no longer an irrelevant actor, if it ever was, especially in the light of the new treaty changes introduced by the Lisbon Treaty, as I already showed, especially bear in mind what I mentioned before with respect to the budget powers. On the other hand, the European Parliament is already, I already showed that the European Parliament is not a unitary actor in the light of the process of normalization and increasing ideological contraposition between along a left-right continuum. On the other hand, we shouldn't forget that the European Parliament is the only directly elected institution of the European Parliament. So if on the one of the European Union. So if on the one hand this implies like wider and broader legitimacy, it also implies the fact that it is much more likely to reflect the societal cleavage that affect the European voters and the European peoples. What we know about the debate on the crisis and why this can have an impact on the voting dynamics of the European Parliament? Well, we know first of all that by its own nature, the crisis is transnational and affects the member states and different strata of the European societies in different ways. On the other hand, we cannot clearly deny the significance of the European crisis that is having strong repercussions both at societal level and in the political dynamics of the member states and of the EU as such. Worth mentioning are, for example, the governmental changes induced by the crisis and induced by external pressures in a number of European countries such as Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and so on and so forth. What we can also see is that the different interests at stake and the different impact that the crisis is having on the distinct member states is creating ad hoc interstate coalitions that are based on the definition and distribution of costs and benefits. Last point has to do with the ideological polarization. The debate on the crisis has a very strong ideological potential, and in the light of the different political and economic receipts proposed according to the ideological position taken, well, different groups of winners and losers emerge. Now, what I will show here is an analysis of the votes on the economic crisis. I will basically compare the votes specifically on measures regarding and dealing with the economic crisis held in the current parliament between 2009 and 2012, with the universe of votes held in the previous and in the current parliament, distinguishing between economic votes and the full amount of votes held. I will analyze 34 votes related to the crisis. These are very specific votes. These are called roll call votes. The roll call votes are basically those votes in which it's registered how every individual legislator voted on every specific vote. These votes represent around 1/3 of all the universe of votes held in the European Parliament. What I will show in the following slides is, on the one hand, the level of cohesion of the party groups in a comparative fashion, the voting alignments of the party groups, how do they change when we basically consider only the votes of crisis with an eye on the full amount of votes, and we will have a look at the voting alignments of the national delegations, that is basically of the national groups of MEPs in the European Parliament. Given the fact that, as we said before, the European crisis has a strong domestic and national characterization. The 34 crisis-related votes represent resolutions and motions for resolutions held in the European Parliament. And they deal with deal mainly with four issues. The first one is the implementation of the stability mechanism. The second one is the financial assistance to the highly indebted member states of the Eurozone. The third one is the creation of the Eurobond and a stronger role for the European Central Bank. In these slides, you have a comparative description of the level of cohesion of the different party groups in the sixth and in the seventh EP. If we look at the table that reproduces the level of cohesion in the current EP, that is in the seventh one, we see a number of relevant points. As you can see, the blue bars represent the level of cohesion on the basis of the full universe of votes. The purple bar represents the level of cohesion on the basis of the votes related to economic and monetary affairs that somehow touch in a more direct or indirect way the economic crisis, while the yellow bar represents the votes only directly related to the economic crisis. What we notice is that in the mainstream party groups, that is in the EPP, Social Democrats and Liberal Democrats, that are said to be part of this grand or super grand coalition, the level of cohesion increases when we consider the economy-related votes. That is, those votes that are related to economic and monetary affairs. We can see in this behavior a kind of burden-sharing approach, an attempt to define a more responsible and cohesive behavior in the light of the debate on the crisis. However, we can see that when we move to the votes that are directly related to the crisis, that is the 34 votes that I described previously, in all the three mainstream parties, the level of cohesion strongly decreases. It decreases of around 10 percentage points when it comes to the Social Democrats, 7 when it comes to the EPP, and again like around 10 points when it comes to the Liberal Democrats. So in all the three mainstream party groups, the level of cohesion, of internal cohesion of the groups, decreases when it comes to the votes directly related to the crisis. That is the most sensitive ones and the ones that are more likely to have an impact of national dynamics and to be affected by the national interest of the different member states. That is, when it comes to the crisis-related votes, the cohesion of the party groups decreases, and that is that their MEPs are less likely and less prone to vote along the party lines. That's the main message that emerges. Moreover, we can also notice like a different behavior when it comes to the radical left and the niche groups and the more non-mainstream groups such as the European conservative and reformist or the Eurosceptic of Europe of freedom and democracy. This result is confirmed, is confirmed also by the comparative assessment of the level of cohesion in the previous parliament, in the sixth one. What we notice is that, again, in the economy-related votes, the level of cohesion has increased from the 6th to the 7th EP of an average percentage of 5%, showing that in economy-related votes, the party groups, the mainstream one, appears to be more responsible and more cohesive. However, in the ones that are more directly related to the crisis, that is, the ones that are more sensitive to national pressure, well, this rally around the flag effect doesn't take place. In these slides, it is summarized the participation of the party groups in winning coalitions. And again, we distinguish between crisis-related votes and the general participation in winning coalitions in all the universe of votes. What we can notice here is that in the 34 crisis-related votes, the grand coalition style appears to be in decline. And again, the voting style seems to be less consociational and more ideological. What we notice is indeed that while in terms of general participation in the winning coalitions, the three mainstream parties appear to be more or less at the same level of involvement in the winning coalitions. If we take into consideration only the votes directly related to the crisis, well, clearly a center-right alignment seems to emerge. In this respect, the European People's Party is involved in all the winning coalitions in the 34 votes taken into consideration. The level of involvement is around 94–95% when it comes to the Liberal Democrats. However, it falls to below 80% when it comes to the Social Democrats. On the other hand, we cannot ignore that although the two mainstream center-right party groups are part of most of the winning coalitions, still the impact of national interests and of nationally oriented pressures are extremely relevant. Worth mentioning are, for example, the case of the votes on the permanent crisis mechanism held in 2010 and on the euro bonds held in 2012. In those cases, a number of defections and long national lines were registered, especially from the Scandinavian member states and the German delegations. In this respect, I would like to mention the level of party cohesion when it comes to the vote on the permanent crisis mechanism in 2010. In that occasion, the level of internal cohesion of the EPP drew to 88%. In the case of the Liberal Democrats, it went to 76%, and in the case of the Social Democrats, it collapsed to 50%, showing a very strong impact of nationality. In order to look at the level of cohesion, at the impact of nationality and of basically how these cleavages have been affected along national lines, I will present you this analysis that has been conducted using a clustering method that basically combines the national delegations according to the degree of similarity in their voting behavior, following a logic of fusion and division. That is basically the voting delegation, the national delegations of MEPs have been combined by this clustering analysis in the light of their voting similarity. And groups have been defined according to a similar voting styles in the national delegations. What we see from this diagram that is called dendrogram is the existence of two macro clusters. First of all, 26 out of the 27 delegations have been properly classified. The only exception is the Irish delegation that has been classified independently. The two clusters that emerged somehow appear to be defined by the membership to the euro area. We can basically see the presence of a euro cluster, including 15 euro delegations, plus Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. These member states are clearly not part of the eurozone. However, this represents the most problematic economies in the non-euro, among the non-euro member states. These three economies have been included in the Vienna Agreement. That is basically an initiative, a mechanism to assist the non-euro economies of Central and Eastern Europe faces a strong sovereign debt crisis. A second cluster includes the non-euro member states, that is 6 delegations not belonging to the euro area, plus the Netherlands. What we see is that the two clusters, the euro one and the non-euro one, are also characterized by 5 geoterritorially defined subclusters. In the euro cluster, we can notice the southern cluster, including Italy, Spain, Romania, Cyprus, and Malta. The Central and Eastern European cluster, including like Bulgaria, Slovenia, Estonia, and Latvia. The continental northern, including France, Germany, Austria, Belgium, and Finland. And within the non-euro clusters, we can see Scandinavian delegations such as Denmark and Sweden, and the what I defined as Eurosceptic Central and Eastern European cluster, including Czech Republic, UK, Latvia, and Poland. To conclude, what we notice is that the different behavior is a different behavior between mainstream and non-mainstream party groups, reflecting those dynamics of responsibility and pragmatism that are defined by the fact that the European Parliament is now an equal co-legislature with the Council, and somehow reflecting the composition of both in terms of mainstream parties within the ranks of the two institutions, the Council and the Parliament. We see that in the current EP, the level of cohesion and the pattern of inter-party coalitions appears more coherent than in the previous one. We can also see a partial effect of burden sharing when it comes to the votes only indirectly related to the crisis, that is, those on economic and monetary affairs held in the current parliament. However, we can also see that in the current parliaments, when it comes to the votes directly related to the crisis, this effect of rally around the flag effect doesn't take place. And that dynamics of exogenous nature, such as geoterritorial factors and factors of national interest, play a big role. What emerges with more relevance and strength is that basically the cleavage doesn't seem to be within the euro area, as it is often being claimed, but between the member states of the euro area and the member states that do not belong to the euro area, somehow reflecting a divergence of interests and a divergence of visions. And with very, very few exceptions, again, like Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania, but these three economies, although not part of the Eurozone, are totally dependent from the Eurozone and somehow tend to follow in their behavior the guidelines of the member states of the national delegations of the Euro area. Thank you very much for your attention, and wish you a good day.